Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your coming. Allow me to introduce ourselves. My name is Laela Hikmah Nurbatra, and this is my former student, Penta Reydita Maharani. So we are from University of Muhammadiyah Malang in East Java, Indonesia, and we are here to present our paper entitled The Students' Difficulties in Using English as Oral Communication in ESP Distance Learning. But before we start, we would like to express our gratitude to the Committee of the International Conference in Innovation and Education for Sustainable Human Resource Department. We feel very honored to participate in this prestigious conference. So our study has two key terms. The first one is the oral communication, in which, according to Zulkarnain and Kaur, it is a communication process directly and verbally that involves at least speaker and one listener, which can include face-to-face or long-distance interactions, such as in the telephone conversations. While the second key point is in the English for specific purpose, which, according to Agustina, teaching English for specific purposes, or commonly known as ESP, is provided with the aim of accommodating the needs of learners with a certain level of English proficiency, where the language will be required as the target needs. So our study have two purposes. As the first purpose is to find out the difficulties faced by the students in using English as oral communication in ESP distance learning, and the second aim is to find out the strategies used by the students to cope with the difficulties in using English as oral communication in ESP distance learning. So in terms of review of related literature, our study is heavily inspired by the work of Zulkarnain and Kaur in 2014, entitled Oral English Communication Difficulties and Coping Strategies of Diploma of Hotel Management Students at UIDM. And their study revealed four different difficulties, which the first one is about resource deficit, focusing on the limited English vocabulary. The second student's difficulty that they reported was processing time pressure, which take a longer time before producing English sentences. The third student difficulties is the on performance problems, focusing on the constructed English sentences wrongly, while the last one is the other performance problems occurring because of the limited knowledge of English language. So their study, Zulkarnain and Kaur in 2014, also suggested two student strategies. The first one is social affective strategies, in which get involved in English oral communication activities, and the second is negotiating for meaning strategies, in which the student can negotiate meaning with the interlocutors. In terms of the research methodology, we have mixed method as the research design. So we combine the quantitative and the qualitative research. So as the research sample, we took 103 ESP students from the nursing program in the academic year 2020 and 2021 within the University of Muhammadiyah Malang in Indonesia. So in terms of data collection, the data was collected through two instruments. The first one is the questionnaire with 25 items of closed-ended questions, and the second technique is the interview with 5 questions supported by the interview guide. To analyze the data, we use the descriptive statistics to analyze the questionnaire, while we also have the quantum analysis to analyze the interview. The result of the research, the conclusion as well as implication will be delivered by Penta. So Penta, the time is yours.
Thank you, Laela, for the time. So the next is findings. So in this study, we found that the student faced 8 difficulties in using English as their oral communication. The first one is difficulties in comprehending oral English speech, difficulties in translating the sentences into English, difficulties in comprehending oral English with specific accents, difficulties in speaking due to speaking anxiety, difficulties in speaking due to limited English vocabulary, difficulties in speaking due to the use of grammar, difficulties in speaking due to pronunciation, and also difficulties in English due to the inability to express ideas or opinion in English. In these findings, we also found that the student has their own strategies to cope with each difficulty. For coping with the first difficulties related to comprehending oral English speech, the student used repeating the audio containing the speaker's speech. The second one is understanding speaker's speech word by word. The third one is asking speaker to use simple sentences and repetition, and also using Google Translate. For coping with the second difficulties related to difficulties in translating the sentences into English, the student used preparing sentences in English first before adjusting to the situation. For coping with the third difficulties related to comprehending oral English speech with specific accent, the student used two strategies, which were trying to guess the speaker's meaning or asking for examples, and also trying to capture the speaker's main point. And for coping with the student difficulties related to speaking anxiety, the student used three strategies, which were trying to relax first and then trying to express what they want to say. The second one is ignoring verbal plans that only spoke in simple sentences, and also preparing sentences in Indonesian first, then translate it into English. For the fifth difficulties faced by students related to limited English vocabulary, the student used watching movies, listening to songs, or read English books as their strategies to cope with the difficulties. For the sixth difficulties related to the use of grammar, the student used try to pay more attention to grammar and correct themselves when they notice that they have made mistakes. For the seven difficulties due to pronunciation, the student used two strategies, which were practicing independently and also asking for examples from others on how to pronounce English sentences correctly. And for the last, students' difficulties related to students' inability to express ideas or opinions in English, the student used reducing the initial sentences that will be spoken, then only use simple sentences. For the discussion, we found that there are 5 most dominant of English oral communication difficulties faced by students, and impressingly, for the first findings, we found that this is the first English oral communication difficulties faced by students in nursing program in the academic year 2020-2021, which were difficulties in comprehending oral English speech. And to cope with these difficulties, the student used four strategies, which were repeating the speaker audio, using Google Translate, and also understanding speakers with word by word in line with Nakatani, and also asking speaker to use simple sentences, also in line with Nakatani 2006. And for the second most dominant of English oral communication difficulties, we have similar findings in the first finding of Zulkarnain in 2014, which related to student difficulties in translating the sentences into English. And for coping with these difficulties, the student used preparing English sentences, then adjusted to the situation. And for the third dominant of English oral communication difficulties, we have similarity with the third findings of study from Indrianti 2020, which related to student difficulties in comprehending our English with specific accent. And to cope with these difficulties, we found that students tried to guess the speaker's meaning or asking for examples, and also trying to capture the speaker's main point, which in line with Nakatani 2006. And for the fourth dominant of English oral communication difficulties, we found that the students have difficulties in speaking due to speaking anxiety. And for coping with this strategy, coping with these difficulties, The student used preparing sentences in Indonesian first, then translate it into English, trying to relate first and then trying to express what they wanted to say, and also ignoring variable place, then only spoke in simple sentences, which will in line with Nakatani 2006. And for the fifth most dominant of English oral communication difficulties faced by students, we have similar findings for in second findings in Zulkarnain and Carl 2014, which related to students' difficulties in speaking due to limited English vocabulary. And for coping with these difficulties, we found that students watching movies, listening to songs, or read English books. So for the conclusion, we can sum up that the study revealed that the students face 8 difficulties in using English as oral communication in the context of ESP Distance Learning, which was solved by their strategies of managing themselves, using gadgets, or using platforms such as Google Translate. And for the implication of this study, we can imply that the teacher needs to find out students' difficulties in using English oral communication during the ESP distance learning. And with the strategies that have been revealed, teachers can help and facilitate the student to cope with those difficulties. Okay, this is the end of our presentation. Thank you for your attention. We really appreciate it if there are any feedback, comments, or question for our study. And thank you.
Thank you very much.